Joining me on the phone to make sense of the myth of Reagan conservatism is Dr. Ivan Eland. Dr. Eland is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Hi, Dr. Eland, and thanks for talking to me tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Well, several years ago, I went ahead and looked at some of the numbers that came out concerning the Reagan presidency, which later resulted in a blog post that I titled The Myth of Reagan Conservatism. This was on a different website, now the Global Dispatch, but I was thoroughly blasted from commenters. They just called me a liberal this, a liberal that, and so on and so forth. And last week, I realized that, I cannot watch certain cable news programs without someone exalting the man, including people like Chris Matthews. Turn on conservative talk radio from Michael Medved to Sean Hannity, and Reagan is consistently held as the conservative to emulate. Dr. Eland, you studied the U.S. presidents, including President Reagan. Without going into great detail, because I'm going to ask more specifics in a moment, how conservative was Ronald Reagan?
I don't really think he was conservative at all. I just went through the Reagan Library, had a conference at the Reagan Library about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, and I went around and examined his role as governor. They have a display, and many of the things he showed very much liberal to moderate governing. And when he got in, he's always had conservative rhetoric, and when he got into the presidency, he had the same conservative rhetoric, and we saw the same pragmatic, moderate governing style. And in fact, sometimes you would call it liberal on certain issues when he was president.
Sure. And, domestically, I hear from all the talking heads, he is this great small government conservative, but the numbers just don't jive. It really blows that theory out of the water. How conservative was Ronald Reagan on entitlements?
Well, he wasn't very conservative at all. He expanded Medicare and Social Security. He cut the benefits very slightly in Social Security, but then he increased the payroll tax, which is a very regressive form of taxation. He got a lot of working Democrats or union members were part of the Reagan coalition, and yet the working poor and that sort of thing were affected by the Social Security increase in payroll taxes. And then also, after he got reelected in 1985, the congressional Republicans showed some spunk and wanted to freeze, which is a pretty minor reform in the whole system, but it was at least something nobody was talking about. They wanted to freeze the cost of living increase for Social Security beneficiaries, and he pulled the rug out from under him after he had been reelected. And of course, they had to get reelected, and he didn't. So he showed absolutely no leadership and ran for the Bushes on the issue. And so he really saved Social Security for another generation by these moves instead of working to dismantle it or to even try to privatize it.
Right. And a lot of people talk about his, big tax cuts when he first came into office. What happened after that?
Well, he raised taxes several times. Now, when he first came into office, he cut the income tax rate, and of course that's the most visible rate to all taxpayers. But he knew that. So what he did was he raised taxes in more obscure parts of the tax code. He calls them revenue enhancements, user fees, anything but increased taxes. They developed all these euphemisms, and it was a very calculated strategy. So if you look at the overall numbers in post-World War II Republican presidents, and they usually cut taxes slightly more than Democratic presidents do, Reagan was last among all the World War II Republicans in the net tax cut after taking those tax increases into account.
Wow. And how about regulations? How was he on that?
Well, he continued. Jimmy Carter started a lot of the things that what you would call conservative that Reagan picked up on. He did try to continue some of the deregulation that Carter had had started. But it was really regulatory relief, easing enforcement and that sort of thing. But that really never works. What you really have to do is get rid of the regulations. And of course, towards the end of the term, they were enforcing and adding new regulations. So I would say his regulation, he may have done a little bit of deregulation, but it was more regulatory relief rather than deregulation.
Right. And I recall when he first got elected, his campaign, he was very specific about getting rid of certain departments in the cabinet and all that. But how was he really in a shrinking government?
Well, in terms of spending, he actually not only increased spending, but increased spending as a portion of GDP. Only Eisenhower and Clinton have reduced federal spending as a portion of GDP. And of course, Clinton is the all-time champion. If you take everybody from Truman on, I exclude Truman because Truman is the all-time prize fighter in budget cutting simply because the government had grown abnormally large during World War II. So, of course, I sort of exclude him because he's sort of an aberration. But if you take Eisenhower on, Reagan doesn't really do well even compared to Clinton and Eisenhower. So Reagan did not do very well in cutting the budget. Also, in terms of federal civilian employees as a portion of the population, Reagan was the second worst next to JFK and LBJ. So he actually increased the number of federal civilian, we're not talking about military people, federal civilian employees as a percentage of the U.S. population. He was the second worst president. So in terms of personnel, in terms of government personnel, and in terms of budgets, we had bigger government, and he didn't even do very well compared to other presidents.
Yeah, and so how can all these people, talking heads, hold him up to such a standing as a conservative? Then I just don't get it.
Well, and there are several reasons. First of all, people they say money talks and BS walks, but a lot of times people do believe in what people say, and a lot of times that when politicians have an image, it doesn't really fit their image at all. Like people think Clinton is a liberal, but if you look at his record, welfare reform, he cut the budget by far more than anybody else did, and so Reagan is deemed a conservative, and yet he has oftentimes presidents can go against their image. Nixon goes to China, for example, right? Nixon was an anti-communist. He went to China. Well, Reagan did a lot of liberal things underneath the conservative banner. In fact, his tear down this wall speech was designed at throwing a bone to conservatives rhetorically because he had just signed the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with the Soviet Union, which all the conservatives hated, and even many moderate defense analysts hated at the time. I was a defense analyst at the time, and their mouths were dropping open because it sort of violated the principles of the Cold War that both Democrats and Republicans had subscribed to up to that point. Now, that's not necessarily to say INF was a bad idea, but it certainly wasn't a conservative idea.
Gotcha. Well, since we headed that way, let's move on to foreign policy. He's given credit for ending the Cold War. It's almost like he went into a phone booth, came out with a cape on, and ended the Cold War all by himself. Is this just another Reagan-created or media-created illusion?
Yes, I think so. The real problem with the Soviet Union was that its economy just didn't work. The Soviet economic growth, contrary to the CIA estimates, started lagging even in the 60s and 70s. And of course, people think of the Soviet Union and they don't think of oil wells, but in fact, Soviet Union had been, and now Russia have been the largest oil producer in the world. They have much oil production. In fact, that's the only thing that anybody ever wanted to buy from them. Well, in the mid-'80s, the oil price crashed because Saudi Arabia was tired of other OPEC producers cheating, so it allowed the oil price to go down, and of course that really hurt the Soviet economy. Now, the Soviet economy probably could have limped along for a little while longer, but Mikhail Gorbachev came in and said, well, you know, I really want to put my efforts into the economy, so I'm going to cast these Eastern European countries aside. He goes, so he put out he ended the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said we're not going to let any country that's communist now go away from communism. And so Gorbachev simply told the Eastern European communist leaders, hey, we're not going to support you militarily anymore. And of course, none of those regimes had legitimacy because they were communists. So, of course, they all fell down, and that's when the Cold War ended. And really, Ronald Reagan had increased the defense budget a bit, and he probably put some added pressure on Gorbachev. But I think, you know, the Cold War had been from Truman on, and so all those presidents, if you're going to give Reagan credit, you know, and you can really say the Cold War only ended in 1991, which was 3 years into when the Soviet Union fell, instead of 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. And if you say that, well, then now it's 3 years into Bush's term, so why doesn't Bush get credit for ending the Cold War? So I think, you know, the U.S. had a strategy from Truman on to contain the Soviet Union and then just let it fall from its own contradictions, meaning that its economy would fall apart. So because it wasn't viable, and that's exactly, you know, what happened. Its economy really was the driving factor for causing Gorbachev to do that. But it was really Gorbachev who did most of it, and this idea that Star Wars did it, Gorbachev knew that he could. The problem with Star Wars, it was very expensive, and offensive nuclear missiles, the offensive weapons, were cheaper. So Gorbachev even said at the time, well, you know, I don't really want to spend this money, but he goes, I can, if I have to, I'll just build a lot of offensive weapons to counter Star Wars. So Star Wars was very destabilizing in the nuclear context. And one of the things that, you know, you can reduce arms, and Ronald Reagan was trying to reduce nuclear arms almost to the point of naivete. He wanted to get rid of all nuclear weapons at Reykjavik, and they almost agreed to do it with the Soviet Union. But because I think Gorbachev was equally naive on the subject. But one of the real problems is when Reagan came into office, he had this harsh rhetoric toward the Soviet Union. And the Soviet leaders actually thought, before Gorbachev came in 1985, they actually thought Reagan was going to nuke the Soviet Union. So they put their nuclear forces in 1983 on high alert because they actually thought the United States was going to do a first strike against them. And to me, that's really the key thing in nuclear weapons, not how many warheads you have, because even now they still have thousands of warheads, and you know, it only takes a few hundred to incinerate the whole country. So that's sort of naive, these arms control agreements. But what really matters is the overall relationship between the two countries, and that was really bad when Reagan came in, and he needlessly caused consternation and almost a nuclear war in 1983. I think it was probably the second worst nuclear confrontation compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the first back in Kennedy's era.
So Reagan pretty much neutralized Nixon's détente.
Well, yes, he did. Although when Carter was already increasing the defense budget when Reagan took office because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. So, and Carter wanted to give the Soviets another Vietnam. His advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted to do that, but when Reagan came in, he really went whole hog on the Afghanistan thing and ended up, I would say both Carter and Reagan helped create Al-Qaeda by beefing up those fundamentalists, because that's where Al-Qaeda came from, was the Mujahideen jihadists, warriors in Afghanistan. But yes, he did, at least rhetorically he did, and then later on he tried to reduce nuclear weapons. But so the two policies were kind of in conflict when they say that, you know, his uniformly hardline policies really collapsed the Soviet Union, but you know, he really didn't do that, because in 1986 and 87 he negotiated the INF Treaty, which reduced eliminated a whole category of nuclear weapons. So, you know, if he was being tough, he wasn't always tough against the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I recall that very vividly, actually. Many, again, I'm going back to the talking heads on TV and radio, they really love to hold up his foreign policy, even though, in my opinion, many of these commentators clearly have a more neoconservative bent than Reagan ever did. And in my opinion, Reagan had a much more measured foreign policy than, say, the Bushes, the Clintons, or what we have now, Obama. Am I wrong?
No, that's certainly true. After the Cold War was over, George W. Bush and Clinton, and even to some extent the elder Bush, there was no enemy left because the Soviet Union had fallen apart, and there was no superpower to constrain the U.S. And of course, Clinton and G.W. Bush in particular have gone whole hog on the interventions. I would even argue that Obama has done the same thing. So, but I think Reagan did amp up the interventionism, started back up the upward slope, because after Vietnam, Ford and Carter had almost no interventions during their administrations. And then Reagan, he picked on small countries like Libya and Grenada, and he got involved in the Beirut debacle, where the Marine Corps barracks was blown up, and of course that's what originally gave Bin Laden the idea that he could make the U.S. get out of places by doing terrorist acts. And so Reagan did have a few interventions, and most of them were small countries that although also in the case of Libya wasn't Libya was launching some terrorist attacks, but it was primarily against Europeans. And of course, when Reagan started attacking him, he started attacking Americans, and that led ultimately to the Pan Am 108 disaster over Lockerbie. So I think one of the big problems with Reagan's foreign policy was the Iran-Contra affair, and to me it was the worst political scandal in U.S. history, even over Watergate. And the reason I say that is because they deliberately ran the secret war in contravention of congressional policy, and they weren't supposed to be spending any money on it. The Congress had forbade them from pumping more money into Nicaragua, to the Nicaraguan Contras who were fighting the Sandinistas, but they did it anyway in violation of Congress's main power under the Constitution, the appropriations power. If Congress says you can't do something and cuts off the money, you're not supposed to do it. And of course, not only did they do that, but they took to get the money to do that, they sold arms to Iran, which had their allies Hezbollah and Lebanon had kidnapped all these Americans. And what they really did was they paid money to the Iran. They sold these weapons to Iran to get the hostages out, even after Iran exhibited bad faith in doing that. And then, of course, Hezbollah, knowing that Reagan really wanted these hostages out, kidnapped more hostages. And so then they took these profits. They violated the Arms Export Control Act, which is a criminal statute, by selling arms to Iran. And then they transferred the money illegally to the Contras in violation of the congressional prohibition. And so it went right to the heart of the checks and balances system of the Constitution. So I think it was probably worse than Nixon's Watergate.
Okay, well, I guess you pretty much answered my next question. I am running out of time, so clearly the Iran-Contra affair was illegal, unconstitutional. So my question for you is, should Ronald Reagan have been impeached for this?
Yeah, I think he probably should have, since Nixon was impeached for Watergate, and Clinton was impeached. Clinton should have been impeached also, but not for the Monica Lewinsky affair. But your question is really about Reagan, and that is, I think he should have been impeached and convicted because it was such a serious. If there's nothing else if Reagan did all other good things, I would still give him a big black mark for the Iran-Contra thing, because I think when you directly undermine the central concept of the U.S. Constitution, I mean, he didn't violate some little portion of the Constitution off on the side. He violated one of the main aspects of the checks and balances system. I think he probably should have been impeached and convicted.
Very good. Well, I've been talking to Dr. Ivan Eland about the myth of Reagan conservatism. Dr. Eland, thanks for joining me tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, take care now.
Bye.